1329 arrived, with Byzantine Emperor Andronikos III Palaiologos, barely 32 years old, but already bearing the weight of an empire collapsing around him, making a decision that would determine whether the Byzantine presence in Anatolia could be salvaged or was irrevocably lost to the surging tide of Turkish conquest. The young emperor, who had seized power from his grandfather just 2 years earlier through civil war, and now ruled an empire reduced to a fraction of its former glory, stood in the great hall of the Battle Palace in Constantinople, surrounded by his military commanders, religious advisors, and aristocratic supporters debating whether he should personally lead an expedition to relieve the besieged city of Nicaea and confront the Ottoman forces that had spent the previous 3 years strangling northwestern Anatolia. The arguments against imperial participation in what would inevitably be a dangerous campaign were numerous and compelling. The emperor's death or capture in battle could trigger catastrophic succession crisis. Constantinople itself needed the emperor's presence to maintain political stability among fractious aristocratic factions, and committing imperial prestige to a campaign that might fail would devastate Byzantine morale more thoroughly than quiet abandonment of distant territories. Yet Andronikos, young and ambitious with romantic notions of imperial glory, still undimmed by the brutal realities of Byzantine decline, insisted that only the emperor's personal leadership could mobilize sufficient forces and inspire the kind of determined resistance necessary to defeat these upstart Turkish raiders and restore Byzantine authority over the Anatolian heartland that had sustained Roman power for over a millennium. The strategic situation that prompted Andronikos's fateful decision combined immediate crisis with long-term trends that painted an increasingly grim picture of Byzantine prospects in Asia Minor. Sultan Orhan Gazi, who had inherited a modest Turkish principality from his father Osman 13 years earlier, had spent the intervening period systematically capturing Byzantine territories through patient siege warfare that strangled cities economically rather than attempting costly direct assaults. Bursa, the largest Byzantine city in northwestern Anatolia, had fallen to the Ottomans in 1326 after years of blockade, providing Orhan with a sophisticated urban capital and revenues that funded further expansion. Nicaea, a city whose name resonated through Christian history as the site where fundamental doctrines had been defined in the 4th century, endured Ottoman siege while desperate appeals for Byzantine relief went unanswered month after month. Beyond these high-profile sieges, dozens of smaller towns and fortresses had surrendered to Ottoman forces or been abandoned by Byzantine garrisons that recognized they could expect no imperial support. The cumulative effect of these losses meant that Byzantine authority in northwestern Anatolia had contracted to a few isolated coastal cities, supplied only by sea, and a handful of inland fortresses, whose continued resistance seemed increasingly pointless. Andronikos recognized that without a dramatic reversal of this momentum, the empire would lose all remaining Asian territories within a generation, becoming a European rump state centered on Constantinople and utterly incapable of the imperial pretensions still maintained in Byzantine court ceremonial. The emperor's plan for the 1329 campaign reflected both strategic ambition and the operational constraints that limited Byzantine military options. He would assemble the largest field army the empire could muster. Historical sources suggest approximately 4,000 cavalry and perhaps 6,000 infantry, modest by the standards of earlier Byzantine expeditions, but substantial given the empire's depleted resources, and lead them personally across the Bosporus into Anatolia. The army would march to relieve Nicaea, breaking the Ottoman siege through the shock of imperial forces' arrival and the presumed superiority of Byzantine heavy cavalry over Turkish light horsemen in pitched battle. Once Nicaea was secured, Byzantine forces would systematically recover recently lost territories, reestablishing imperial administration and demonstrating to wavering populations that the empire retained the capacity to defend its subjects. The Ottomans, confronted by determined imperial resistance led by the emperor himself, would recognize the futility of challenging Byzantine power and either withdraw to their frontier territories or negotiate tributary status, acknowledging imperial supremacy. This optimistic scenario reflected both Andronikos's youthful confidence and fundamental misunderstanding of Ottoman capabilities, treating Orhan's forces as traditional Turkish raiders who could be intimidated by impressive displays of imperial might, rather than recognizing them as an increasingly sophisticated military organization capable of adapting tactics to exploit Byzantine weaknesses. The Byzantine military forces assembled by Andronikos for the campaign represented the empire's best efforts to mobilize military power that could challenge Ottoman expansion. yet revealed the severe limitations and structural weaknesses that would ultimately doom the expedition to failure. The core of the army consisted of approximately 4,000 heavy cavalry, the famed Byzantine cataphracts who had dominated Mediterranean battlefields for centuries, armored warriors mounted on powerful horses, capable of devastating charges that could break enemy formations. Yet these impressive forces masked serious deficiencies. Many of the cavalry were actually aristocratic retainers serving their lords rather than professional soldiers, loyal primarily to the emperor, creating command complications and divided loyalties. The empire could no longer afford to maintain large, permanent military establishments, meaning that assembling even this modest force required months of negotiation with aristocratic magnates who provided troops in exchange for concessions that weakened imperial authority. And Byzantine military doctrine had not significantly evolved to address the tactical challenges posed by Turkish mounted archers, whose mobility and firepower could devastate heavy cavalry if engagements could be fought on Turkish terms rather than in the set-piece battles where Byzantine advantages would be decisive. The infantry component, though numerically larger, consisted primarily of lightly armed troops of questionable quality and uncertain loyalty, supplemented by some foreign mercenaries whose motivation extended only as far as regular pay that Byzantine finances could not always guarantee. The Ottoman military situation in 1329 contrasted sharply with Byzantine decline, revealing a dynamic, expanding power whose military capabilities had evolved dramatically during 13 years of nearly constant warfare under Orhan's leadership. The Sultan could field perhaps 10,000 warriors, including elite cavalry, Ghazi motivated by a combination of religious fervor, desire for plunder, and loyalty to a leader who had consistently delivered victories and rewards. Ottoman forces had learned through bitter experience how to conduct siege operations, how to coordinate cavalry and infantry effectively, how to exploit terrain advantages, and most importantly, how to avoid fighting on enemy terms while creating battlefield conditions that maximized Turkish strengths. Orhan's warriors understood that Byzantine heavy cavalry was formidable in direct charges across open terrain, but vulnerable to harassment by mounted archers. That Byzantine infantry lacked the mobility to respond to fast-moving Turkish cavalry, and that the longer any engagement could be prolonged without decisive battle, the more logistical and morale problems would afflict the Byzantine forces. According to historical analysis by scholars such as Mark Bartossus, whose comprehensive studies of late Byzantine military organization document the period's armies in detail, the Byzantine forces Andronikos led into Anatolia in 1329 were facing an Ottoman military that had evolved specifically to counter Byzantine tactical doctrines and exploit the empire's systemic weaknesses. The psychological dimensions of the impending confrontation carried enormous significance for both sides, as the battle would test not just military capabilities, but also competing narratives about divine favor, historical destiny, and the relative legitimacy of Byzantine Christian and Ottoman Muslim claims to govern Anatolia. For the Byzantines, the emperor's personal presence sanctified the expedition as a holy ward defending Christianity against Islamic expansion, with religious authorities blessing the army and proclaiming that God would grant victory to the faithful defending territories that had been Christian for over a millennium. The participation of numerous aristocratic family scions meant that the Byzantine social elite had invested personal honor in the campaign's success, creating powerful incentives for bravery while also ensuring that failure would devastate the imperial system's credibility. For the Ottomans, the approaching confrontation offered an opportunity to defeat the Byzantine emperor himself in open battle, a victory that would shatter Byzantine prestige throughout the region and validate Ottoman expansion as divinely ordained jihad rather than mere banditry. Orhan understood that defeating an imperial army led by the emperor personally would accomplish more than years of patient siege warfare, in demonstrating that Ottoman power had surpassed Byzantine capability and that the future of Anatolia belonged to the Turks rather than the Romans, who had ruled for 13 centuries. June 1329 witnessed Emperor Andronikos III leading his assembled Byzantine army across the Bosporus Strait at Chalcedon, the ancient crossing point where Asian and European shores nearly touched, and where countless Roman and Byzantine armies had passed between continents over more than a millennium of imperial history. The spectacle of the emperor personally leading his forces into Asia, surrounded by the empire's greatest aristocrats in gleaming armor, accompanied by priests carrying sacred icons and relics, and followed by thousands of soldiers in disciplined formations, was calculated to inspire both his own troops and the Anatolian populations who had witnessed the army's passage. Byzantine propagandists ensured that word spread throughout the region that the emperor himself had come to restore Roman authority, that the full might of the Byzantine Empire was being deployed against the Turkish upstarts, and that any who had submitted to Ottoman pressure should prepare to return to imperial allegiance or face consequences as traitors. The psychological impact of this impressive display initially seemed to achieve its intended effect, as some recently conquered territories sent delegations pledging renewed loyalty to Byzantium, and Ottoman advance forces withdrew before the Byzantine army's approach rather than risking engagement with such formidable forces. Yet the Ottoman response to the Byzantine advance revealed sophisticated strategic thinking that contrasted sharply with the emperor's expectations of intimidating the Turks into withdrawal or forcing them into disadvantageous pitched battle. Sultan Orhan, receiving intelligence about Byzantine movements from his extensive network of scouts and informants, did not attempt to lift the siege of Nicaea or concentrate his dispersed forces for immediate confrontation with the imperial army. Instead, he implemented a strategy of tactical withdrawal and harassment that would draw Byzantine forces deeper into Anatolia, while avoiding the kind of set-piece battle where Byzantine heavy cavalry might prove decisive. Ottoman cavalry units shadowed the Byzantine advance, launching hit-and-run attacks against foraging parties, ambushing isolated detachments, and creating constant pressure that required the Byzantines to maintain exhausting vigilance. Turkish mounted archers would appear seemingly from nowhere, loose volleys of arrows that caused casualties and confusion, then disappear before Byzantine heavy cavalry could organize effective pursuit. This pattern of harassment, though causing relatively limited immediate damage, began wearing down Byzantine morale and creating doubts about whether the imperial army would ever catch the elusive Ottoman forces in the kind of formal battle that Byzantine tactical doctrine was designed to win. The Byzantine logistical situation deteriorated rapidly as the army marched through territories that had been devastated by years of Ottoman raiding and Byzantine-Turkish conflict, finding villages abandoned or destroyed and agricultural production disrupted to the point where the region could not support a large military force. Andronikos had planned to supply his army through a combination of provisions brought from Constantinople, supplies requisitioned from local populations, and materials captured from Ottoman forces or sympathizers. Yet the destruction of the region's agricultural infrastructure meant local requisitions yielded far less than anticipated. The Ottoman harassment of supply convoys meant provisions from Constantinople arrived irregularly or not at all, and the Turkish forces' superior mobility meant they could avoid concentrating supplies where Byzantine forces might capture them. Within 2 weeks of crossing into Asia, the Byzantine army was experiencing food shortages that required reducing rations, creating grumbling among soldiers who had been promised adequate supplies and beginning the erosion of morale that would prove more dangerous than any Turkish military threat. The emperor's commanders increasingly recognized that they faced a strategic dilemma. Advancing deeper into Anatolia in pursuit of Ottoman forces would extend already precarious supply lines to breaking point. Yet withdrawing without achieving any substantive victory would constitute a humiliating admission of failure that would devastate Byzantine credibility. The turning point came in late June 1329, when Andronikos received intelligence suggesting that Orhan had concentrated significant Ottoman forces near the town of Pelekanon, approximately 20 miles southeast of Nicaea in the hills overlooking the approaches to the besieged city. The report indicated that the Sultan himself was present with his main army, presenting the opportunity for decisive battle that the emperor had sought since crossing into Anatolia. Byzantine commanders debated whether the intelligence was reliable, or whether it represented Ottoman dissection designed to lure imperial forces into a trap, with some cautious advisors warning that the Turks had consistently avoided confrontation, and that their sudden willingness to offer battle suggested they had chosen terrain and circumstances favorable to their tactics. Yet Andronikos, young and eager for the glory of defeating the Ottoman Sultan in open combat, overruled these concerns and ordered the army to march toward Pelekanon, confident that Byzantine military superiority would prevail in pitched battle regardless of tactical circumstances. This fateful decision, driven by the emperor's desire for dramatic victory rather than sober assessment of risks and advantages, would determine not just the battle's outcome but the future of Byzantine Anatolia for the remaining century of the empire's existence. The terrain around Pelekanon presented significant tactical challenges for Byzantine forces, while offering multiple advantages to Ottoman defenders. Though whether Andronikos fully appreciated these geographic factors remains unclear from the historical sources. The region consisted of rolling hills covered with scattered woodlands and broken by numerous ravines and gullies, terrain that favored mobile light cavalry capable of rapid movement across broken ground, while hindering the coordinated charges of heavy cavalry that formed the core of Byzantine tactical doctrine. The roads approaching from the coast where the Byzantine army had landed were narrow and easily blocked, meaning that Byzantine forces would need to deploy from columns into battle formations while under potential enemy observation and harassment. Most significantly, the hills around Pelekanon offered excellent positions for Turkish mounted archers to rain arrows down on Byzantine formations, while remaining difficult to reach through direct cavalry charges uphill, across broken terrain. Some Byzantine commanders, recognizing these tactical disadvantages, urged the emperor to refuse battle at Pelekanon and instead attempt to maneuver the Ottomans into more favorable ground or simply bypass their position to relieve Nicaea directly. Yet Andronikos, perhaps concerned that refusing battle would appear cowardly, or perhaps genuinely believing that Byzantine martial superiority would overcome terrain disadvantages, insisted on engaging the Ottoman forces and bringing the campaign to a decisive conclusion. The night before battle, as Byzantine and Ottoman forces camped within sight of each other across the contested ground near Pelekanon, both armies prepared spiritually and materially for the confrontation that all recognized would have consequences extending far beyond immediate tactical outcomes. Byzantine forces attended special religious services where priests blessed soldiers, distributed communion, and proclaimed that God favored the Christian defenders against Muslim invaders, creating an atmosphere of sacred crusade that was meant to inspire courage and resignation to divine will. Emperor Andronikos moved through the camps personally, speaking with common soldiers and aristocratic commanders alike, promising rewards for bravery and reminding his troops that they fought for the empire's survival and Christianity's defense. Yet despite these morale-building efforts, many Byzantine soldiers recognized the unfavorable tactical situation and questioned privately whether their commanders had led them into a trap. Ottoman forces conducted their own religious preparations, with Islamic scholars reciting Quranic verses and pronouncing the coming battle as jihad, whose participants would earn divine reward regardless of whether they achieved martyrdom or victory. Sultan Orhan, demonstrating the common touch that had earned his warriors' loyalty, personally visited various units within his army, speaking in the plain Turkish dialect that contrasted with Byzantine court formality, reminding his men of previous victories, and promising that the coming battle would break Byzantine power in Anatolia forever. June 10, 1329, broke with the sun rising over the hills around Pelekanon to illuminate two armies arrayed for battle in formations that reflected fundamentally different tactical doctrines and strategic purposes. Emperor Andronikos III had deployed his Byzantine forces in a traditional battle array, heavy cavalry concentrated in the center, where their devastating charge could break enemy formations, infantry protecting the flanks and preventing envelopment, and reserves positioned to exploit breakthroughs or reinforce threatened sectors. The deployment reflected Byzantine military theory refined over centuries, emphasizing the decisive cavalry charge that would shatter enemy cohesion and turn the battle into a pursuit and a massacre of broken foes. The emperor himself took position with the cavalry center, his presence meant to inspire the troops while also placing imperial prestige directly in harm's way, in a public demonstration of his willingness to share his soldiers' dangers. The Byzantine formations looked impressive from a distance, with armored cavalry glinting in the morning sun, banners displaying imperial eagles and religious icons fluttering in the breeze, and the serried ranks suggesting military might that had dominated Mediterranean battlefields for generations. Sultan Orhan's Ottoman deployment reflected entirely different tactical philosophy, emphasizing mobility, firepower, and avoidance of the kind of confrontation where Byzantine heavy cavalry advantages would be decisive. Turkish forces were arrayed in loose formations that could rapidly disperse and reconcentrate, with mounted archers positioned on both flanks where they could harass Byzantine formations with arrow volleys, while maintaining the ability to withdraw quickly if threatened by cavalry charges. Elite Ghazi warriors, the core of Ottoman striking power, held positions in reserve where they could exploit opportunities created by the mounted archers' harassment or counterattack if Byzantine forces committed fully to pursuit. Most significantly, Orhan had positioned substantial forces in the wooded hills flanking the battlefield, concealed from Byzantine view but positioned to launch devastating flank attacks once battle was joined and Byzantine formations became committed. This deployment demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Byzantine tactical weaknesses and careful preparation to exploit the terrain advantages that Pelekanon offered to defenders willing to fight on their own terms rather than accepting battle on Byzantine terms. The battle opened not with the massive cavalry charge that Byzantine tactical doctrine emphasized, but with long-range harassment by Ottoman mounted archers who advanced within bow range of Byzantine formations, loosed volleys of arrows, and withdrew before Byzantine cavalry could close to contact. This pattern of attack and withdrawal repeated again and again over several hours, proved psychologically devastating to Byzantine forces who found themselves under constant missile fire without the ability to close with the elusive enemy and employ their superior close combat capabilities. Byzantine heavy cavalry attempted several charges to break up the Turkish archer formations, but found that the Ottomans simply retreated at speed across broken terrain where the heavily armored Byzantine horses could not maintain pursuit, then reformed and resumed their harassment once the frustrated Byzantine cavalry returned to their positions. The cumulative effect of this attritional combat was a steady drain on Byzantine morale and mounting casualties from arrow wounds that, while individually rarely fatal through armor, accumulated to significant losses and created an atmosphere of helplessness among soldiers accustomed to decisive engagements rather than this war of harassment. Emperor Andronikos, watching his army suffering under Turkish arrow fire without achieving any meaningful engagement, faced the classic tactical dilemma that had destroyed many commanders throughout history: whether to maintain defensive formations and endure continued attrition, or launch an all-out assault, risking everything on one decisive charge that might break enemy resistance, or might be lured into a trap. The emperor's military advisors were divided, with some urging patience and suggesting that the Ottoman arrows would eventually exhaust themselves, allowing Byzantine forces to advance methodically, while others argued that prolonged defensive fighting was destroying morale, and that only bold offensive action could seize initiative and transform the battle's psychological dynamics. According to Byzantine chronicles compiled after the battle, and analyzed by historians such as Nicaea, whose detailed studies of Byzantine-Ottoman military encounters provide authoritative documentation of these engagements, Andronikos eventually decided on a compromise approach. He would launch a major cavalry assault with substantial forces but maintain sufficient reserves to prevent complete disaster if the attack failed. This decision, though reasonable given the circumstances, would prove inadequate to overcome the tactical trap Orhan had carefully prepared. The great Byzantine cavalry charge that finally came in mid-afternoon represented the empire's last offensive thrust in defense of Anatolia, thousands of armored horsemen thundering across the broken ground toward Ottoman positions in a spectacle that would have been decisive in earlier eras when Byzantine military superiority was unquestioned. The initial impact of the charge seemed promising from the Byzantine perspective, as Turkish mounted archers fell back before the advancing heavy cavalry and some Ottoman units appeared to break and flee in disarray. For a brief moment, Byzantine commanders allowed themselves to hope that traditional martial superiority was reasserting itself, and that the Ottomans were reverting to the expected pattern of nomadic warriors fleeing before professional soldiers disciplined assault. Yet this appearance of victory was carefully orchestrated deception, as the retreating Ottoman forces were executing a planned tactical withdrawal designed to draw Byzantine cavalry into broken terrain, where their formations would lose cohesion and become vulnerable to counterattack from the Turkish forces concealed in the surrounding hills and woodlands. The Ottoman counterattack, when it erupted from multiple directions against Byzantine cavalry that had pursued too far and become strung out across difficult terrain, transformed the battle from a Byzantine offensive into a catastrophic imperial defeat within a matter of hours. Turkish mounted warriors emerged from concealed positions in the hills, launching devastating charges against the flanks and rear of Byzantine cavalry formations that were facing forward and had lost the tight formations essential for mutual support. Ottoman arrows rained down from elevated positions where Turkish archers could fire with impunity into Byzantine ranks without fear of cavalry charges uphill across ground deliberately chosen to prevent effective mounted pursuit. The Byzantine cavalry, caught in a killing zone where their advantages in armor and close combat were negated by terrain and tactical situation, while their weaknesses in mobility and flexibility were ruthlessly exploited, began to break as individual units sought to withdraw from the trap. What had begun as a coordinated offensive assault devolved into fragmented, desperate fighting as Byzantine warriors recognized they were surrounded and attempted either to cut their way out or surrender on terms that might preserve their lives. The critical moment that sealed Byzantine defeat and ended any realistic hope of salvaging the campaign came when Emperor Andronikos III himself, fighting in the thick of the cavalry engagement and reportedly demonstrating considerable personal bravery despite his youth and limited combat experience, recognized that his forces were being systematically destroyed and that remaining on the battlefield risked not just military defeat but his own death or capture, with all the catastrophic political consequences that would entail. Byzantine chroniclers, who later recounted the battle, struggled to frame the emperor's decision to withdraw as anything other than flight from the battlefield, employing euphemisms about strategic repositioning and preservation of imperial person for future campaigns. Yet the fundamental reality was clear. Andronikos abandoned his army and fled toward the coast, protected by his bodyguard unit, while thousands of Byzantine soldiers were left to face Ottoman swords and arrows without their supreme commander's presence. This imperial flight, however militarily justified it might have been from the perspective of preserving the dynasty and preventing a succession crisis, devastated Byzantine morale and transformed what might have been an orderly withdrawal into a chaotic rout, as soldiers recognized that if the emperor himself was fleeing, the battle was irretrievably lost. The immediate aftermath of the emperor's withdrawal witnessed the complete disintegration of Byzantine military cohesion, as units that had maintained formation despite heavy casualties and an unfavorable tactical situation now broke entirely when word spread that Andronikos had abandoned the field. Byzantine heavy cavalry, the empire's elite military force, scattered in all directions, seeking escape routes through the hills and woodlands that just hours earlier had seemed to offer tactical advantages to defenders. Infantry formations left without cavalry support, and facing mounted Ottoman warriors who could move far faster than foot soldiers could withdraw, attempted to form defensive squares but were systematically surrounded and annihilated or forced to surrender. The retreat toward the coast, where Byzantine vessels might offer escape to Constantinople, became a nightmare pursuit as Ottoman cavalry hunted down fleeing Byzantine soldiers across miles of Anatolian countryside, killing, capturing, or scattering the remnants of what had been the empire's field army. Historical accounts suggest that perhaps of the Byzantine forces engaged at Pelekanon were killed, captured, or went missing in the battle and subsequent pursuit, a catastrophic loss from which the empire's Anatolian military capacity would never recover. Sultan Orhan's response to the Byzantine collapse revealed both his tactical competence and his strategic wisdom in recognizing that maximizing enemy losses without risking his own forces unnecessary. Casualties served Ottoman interests better than the romantic pursuit of glorious charges. He ordered a systematic pursuit of fleeing Byzantine forces, but explicitly prohibited reckless charges that might allow trapped enemy units to inflict disproportionate casualties on overeager Ottoman warriors. Turkish cavalry was instructed to surround Byzantine remnants and offer surrender terms rather than fighting to the last man, a policy that both minimized Ottoman casualties and created an incentive for demoralized Byzantine soldiers to capitulate rather than fighting desperately. Most significantly, Orhan did not attempt to pursue Emperor Andronikos all the way to the coast, or to attack the Byzantine naval vessels that would carry the defeated emperor back to Constantinople, recognizing that allowing Andronikos to escape alive but humiliated served Ottoman propaganda purposes better than killing him would have. A dead emperor might become a martyr, inspiring Byzantine resistance. A living emperor who had fled his army's destruction would serve as a walking testament to Byzantine impotence and Ottoman superiority. The casualty figures from the Battle of Pelekanon, though impossible to determine precisely given medieval record-keeping limitations and the natural tendency of both sides to exaggerate enemy losses while minimizing their own, nonetheless clearly indicated devastating Byzantine defeat that approached the level of catastrophic military disaster. Byzantine sources, though reluctant to admit the full scale of the defeat, acknowledge losing approximately 2,000 soldiers killed in battle or the subsequent pursuit, with perhaps another 1,500 captured and countless others wounded or scattered. These losses represented perhaps half of the army Andronikos had led into Anatolia, including disproportionately high casualties among the aristocratic cavalry who formed the empire's military elite. Ottoman losses, though contemporary chronicles provide wildly varying estimates, were almost certainly far lower, perhaps 500 killed and a similar number wounded. Acceptable casualties for a decisive victory that had broken Byzantine power in Anatolia. The disparity in casualties reflected not just Ottoman tactical superiority, but also the fundamental reality that the side that controlled the battlefield after fighting could care for its wounded and recover equipment, while the defeated force lost both those who died in combat and many of the wounded who could not be evacuated during chaotic retreat. The immediate strategic consequences of the Byzantine defeat at Pelekanon extended far beyond the military losses to encompass psychological and political dimensions that would prove even more devastating for imperial prospects. Emperor Andronikos' return to Constantinople and the aftermath of a catastrophic defeat triggered an immediate political crisis, as aristocratic factions that had always resented his seizure of power from his grandfather seized upon the military humiliation to challenge his authority and competence. Byzantine morale throughout the empire plummeted as news spread that the emperor himself had led the largest Byzantine field army assembled in years into battle against the Ottomans, and suffered a humiliating defeat. seeming to confirm that Byzantine military decline was irreversible and that the empire could no longer effectively defend its territories. Most devastatingly for Byzantine Anatolian possessions, populations that had maintained loyalty to Constantinople despite years of Ottoman pressure now recognized that the empire lacked the military capacity to protect them and began calculating whether accommodation with the Ottomans might serve their interests better than continued doomed resistance to the inevitable. According to historical analysis by scholars such as Donald Nicol, whose comprehensive studies of late Byzantine history document the empire's final centuries in detail, the Battle of Pelekanon's psychological impact proved more destructive than the immediate military losses, as it shattered Byzantine confidence that effective resistance to Ottoman expansion remained possible. The reaction throughout the Christian world to news of the Byzantine defeat at Pelekanon combined shock at the magnitude of the disaster with resignation to what increasingly appeared to be the Byzantine Empire's inevitable dissolution. Pope John XXII issued statements decrying the Muslim conquest of Christian territories and calling for European assistance to the beleaguered Byzantines. But these papal proclamations generated minimal concrete action, given Europe's preoccupation with the Hundred Years' War and various local conflicts. Venice and Genoa, the major Italian maritime republics with substantial commercial interests in Byzantine territories, expressed concern primarily about how the defeat might affect their trading privileges and began opening diplomatic channels with the Ottomans to protect commercial interests regardless of political outcomes. The Kingdom of Hungary and other European powers that theoretically might have assisted Byzantium instead focused on their own regional conflicts and showed no inclination to commit resources to defending distant Byzantine territories. This European indifference demonstrated conclusively that Byzantine appeals to Christian solidarity meant little when individual European powers prioritized their particular interests, leaving the empire to face Ottoman expansion essentially alone, regardless of how many times Byzantine emperors sent embassies pleading for crusading assistance. The weeks following the Byzantine defeat at Pelekanon witnessed Sultan Orhan consolidating his victory's strategic advantages while avoiding overextension that might dissipate the momentum gained through successful battle. He made no immediate attempt to march on Constantinople or launch major new offensives, recognizing that his forces, though victorious, had also sustained casualties and exhaustion requiring rest and recuperation. Instead, he focused on tightening the siege of Nicaea, understanding that the city's fall would not be inevitable, given that the Byzantine relief expedition had been destroyed and no further imperial assistance could realistically be expected. Ottoman forces that had been diverted to confront Andronikos' army returned to siege positions around Nicaea, their morale enormously enhanced by the recent victory and their confidence in Ottoman superiority vindicated by battlefield success. The psychological impact on Indonesia's defenders of learning that the emperor himself had led a relief expedition directly to them only to be defeated and forced to flee proved devastating, as it confirmed their worst fears that they were truly abandoned to face Ottoman siege alone without any realistic prospect of rescue. The political maneuvering within Nicaea during the months following Pelekanon revealed how military defeat in the field accelerated the psychological processes that eventually led to surrendered cities accepting Ottoman rule. Defenders who had maintained unity through years of siege, sustained by hope that Byzantine relief would eventually arrive, now fractured into competing factions debating whether continued resistance served any purpose. Hardline Byzantine loyalists, primarily religious conservatives and some aristocrats emotionally committed to the empire, argued that surrender constituted unforgivable betrayal regardless of circumstances and that Christian duty required resistance even unto death. Pragmatists, including many military officers, merchants, and common citizens, pointed out that the emperor himself had demonstrated Byzantine military impotence, that no further relief could be expected, and that negotiating surrender while the garrison still possessed some bargaining leverage would secure better terms than waiting until starvation forced unconditional capitulation. Orthodox bishops struggled with competing theological imperatives, whether preserving Christian lives took precedence over maintaining Byzantine Christian political authority, and whether accepting Muslim Turkish rule with guaranteed religious freedom constituted an acceptable compromise or damnable accommodation with infidels. Orhan's diplomatic offensive during this period demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit Byzantine demoralization and factional divisions within besieged cities. He sent messages into Nicaea offering extraordinarily generous surrender terms. The garrison could withdraw to Constantinople with full military honors and personal property. Civilians could choose to leave safely or remain under guaranteed religious freedom and property protection. Orthodox churches would remain Christian places of worship except for the main cathedral. and those who stayed would pay lower taxes under Ottoman administration than they had paid to Byzantine authorities. These offers, far more generous than what medieval conquerors typically provided, reflected Orhan's strategic calculation that establishing a reputation for honorable dealing would make future Byzantine cities more willing to negotiate surrender rather than enduring prolonged sieges. The Sultan understood that every city that surrendered peacefully, rather than being taken by storm, saved Ottoman lives and resources, while also creating precedents that would facilitate subsequent expansion. This policy of calculated generosity would prove among his most effective strategic innovations. The human suffering within Nicaea during the months following Pelekanon, though not yet as catastrophic as the terminal starvation that would eventually force surrender, nonetheless imposed significant hardships that gradually eroded the will to resist. The Byzantine defeat had not immediately cut Nicaea's maritime supply lines, as vessels from Constantinople could still navigate Lake Ascanius, bringing food and other provisions. Yet the psychological impact of knowing that the empire's field army had been destroyed and that no military relief would come transformed the population's calculus about their ultimate fate. Food prices increased steadily as merchants recognized that supply difficulties would only worsen over time. Wealthy families began hoarding resources in preparation for either the final siege or potential flight. Common citizens questioned why they should endure continued hardship for an empire that had proven unable to protect them. Disease spread through the crowded city as stress and gradually declining nutrition weakened immune systems. Most insidiously, the garrison's discipline began eroding as soldiers recognized that they were being asked to sacrifice indefinitely for a strategic situation that was hopeless, creating incidents of desertion, petty crime, and occasionally open defiance of authority that would have been unthinkable earlier in the siege. The Byzantine strategic position throughout northwestern Anatolia collapsed with remarkable rapidity in the year following Pelekanon, as populations and garrisons throughout the region recognized that the empire could not defend them and began either fleeing to Constantinople or negotiating accommodation with Ottoman authorities. Smaller fortresses and towns that had maintained Byzantine loyalty despite years of Ottoman pressure now sent delegations to Orhan offering to open their gates in exchange for the generous terms he was known to provide. Byzantine provincial administrators, recognizing that their positions were untenable, either abandoned their posts and fled to imperial territories or, in some cases, switched allegiance to the Ottomans and offered to serve the new power in exchange for maintaining their status and property. The aristocratic families that had dominated northwestern Anatolian society for generations faced agonizing choices about whether to abandon estates their ancestors had held for centuries and flee to uncertain refugee status in Constantinople, or remain under Ottoman rule and hope that the promised religious tolerance and property protections would be honored. This wholesale psychological collapse of Byzantine Anatolia's will to resist demonstrated that Pelekanon's significance extended far beyond the immediate battlefield casualties to encompass the destruction of Byzantine credibility and morale throughout the region. The economic and demographic consequences of the Byzantine defeat and subsequent Ottoman consolidation transformed northwestern Anatolia's character in ways that would prove irreversible despite occasional Byzantine attempts at reconquest over subsequent decades. Greek Christian populations began emigrating en masse to Constantinople and other Byzantine European territories, creating a refugee crisis that strained the capital's resources while depopulating Anatolian regions that had been Greek-speaking and Christian for over a millennium. Simultaneously, Turkish populations migrated into the region in increasing numbers, attracted by Ottoman policies that offered land and opportunities to settlers willing to colonize newly conquered territories. This demographic transformation, accelerated by the psychological shock of Pelekanon, represented the beginning of Anatolia's gradual shift from predominantly Greek Christian to predominantly Turkish Muslim character that would be largely complete within several generations. The economic disruption caused by warfare, population movements, and administrative transition created short-term hardship but also destroyed Byzantine aristocratic land tenure systems that had oppressed peasant populations for centuries, opening possibilities for social reorganization under Ottoman administration that would eventually prove more prosperous and stable than late Byzantine governance had been. The final surrender of Nicaea to Ottoman forces in 1331, 2 years after the Battle of Pelekanon had destroyed Byzantine hopes of relief, represented the symbolic completion of Byzantine expulsion from northwestern Anatolia and validated everything the Pelekanon victory had suggested about the irreversible shift in regional power dynamics. The city that had endured years of siege sustained by hope that imperial relief would eventually arrive finally capitulated, when accumulated evidence made clear that no such relief would ever come. that the empire had effectively abandoned its Asian territories, and that continued resistance would only prolong suffering without achieving any strategic purpose. The surrender negotiations revealed how thoroughly Pelekanon had undermined Byzantine bargaining position, as Nicaea's representatives could make no credible threats about holding out indefinitely or inflicting unacceptable casualties on Ottoman attackers when everyone recognized that the city was isolated and would eventually fall regardless of how bravely defenders fought. Yet Orhan, maintaining the policy of calculated generosity that had served him so effectively, offered terms nearly identical to those promised before Pelekanon, demonstrating that Ottoman victory had not made him more demanding, but rather more confident in his ability to govern conquered territories effectively through fairness rather than terror. The Ottoman occupation and administration of captured Nicaea followed the patterns Orhan had established in Bursa, but with additional sophistication reflecting lessons learned from several years of governing Byzantine urban populations. The Sultan personally entered the city through the main gate in a carefully choreographed ceremony that balanced triumph with respect for the defeated, leading his warriors in disciplined formation rather than allowing the chaotic plundering that often followed medieval city captures. He immediately established his authority by appointing governors and administrators, many of them Greek Christians from Bursa who had proven their competence and loyalty under Ottoman rule, sending a clear message that merit and capability mattered more than religious or ethnic identity in Ottoman service. He commissioned major building projects, mosques, madrasas, bathhouses, and markets that would employ people while physically transforming Nicaea's urban landscape to reflect its new Ottoman identity. Most crucially for winning over the skeptical population, he ensured that the promised protections for Christian religious practices and property rights were rigorously enforced, with public punishment for any Ottoman soldiers or officials who violated these guarantees, creating an atmosphere where Greek Christians recognized that Ottoman promises were genuine rather than tactical deceptions that would be abandoned once resistance ended. The psychological and strategic implications of Nicaea's fall reverberated throughout the Byzantine world, confirming what Pelekanon had suggested, that the empire's Anatolian presence was finished, and that future Byzantine history would be confined to Constantinople, Thrace, and scattered European possessions. Emperor Andronikos III, receiving news of Nicaea's surrender, reportedly expressed profound despair at the loss of a city whose Christian historical significance rivaled any Byzantine possession. Byzantine religious authorities proclaimed days of mourning and penitential services, struggling to explain theologically why God would permit such a sacred city's conquest by Muslim forces if Byzantium truly retained divine favor. Aristocratic families throughout the empire processed the news with a mixture of resignation and recrimination, some blaming the emperor's military incompetence while others recognized that Byzantine defeat reflected systemic imperial decline that no individual could have prevented. Common citizens in Constantinople and other Byzantine cities, watching Greek Christian refugees from Anatolia arriving by the thousands with traumatic accounts of Ottoman conquest, recognized with growing clarity that the empire that claimed to be the eternal heir of Rome was actually a declining regional power incapable of defending even its core territories. The broader Christian world's reaction to Nicaea's fall combined rhetorical outrage with continued practical indifference to Byzantine pleas for military assistance. Pope John XXII issued passionate statements about the tragedy of losing the city, where Christian orthodoxy had been defined in the 4th century, and renewed calls for crusading expeditions to recover the lost territories. Yet these papal proclamations generated no more concrete action than previous appeals had produced, as European powers remained focused on their own conflicts and showed no willingness to commit substantial resources to defending distant Byzantine possessions. Venice and Genoa, the Italian maritime republics with commercial interests throughout the Byzantine world, responded to Ottoman expansion primarily by negotiating favorable trade agreements with Orhan rather than organizing military opposition. The Kingdom of Serbia, Bulgaria, and other Balkan Christian powers that theoretically shared religious affinity with Byzantium proved more interested in exploiting Byzantine weakness to expand their own territories than in supporting the empire against Muslim expansion. This pattern of Christian disunity and self-interest, which had characterized European response to Byzantine difficulties for centuries, ensured that the empire would face Ottoman expansion essentially alone, regardless of how desperately it appealed to religious solidarity. The transformation of Ottoman's strategic position in the years following Pelekanon and Nicaea's capture positioned Orhan's state as the clearly dominant power in northwestern Anatolia, with realistic prospects for expansion that would ultimately create one of history's great empires. The Sultan now controlled all major Byzantine cities in the region, Bursa, Nicaea, and soon Nicomedia, along with extensive territories connecting them, providing secure bases, substantial revenues, and access to the Sea of Marmara coastline. His military forces, enhanced by victories' prestige and growing steadily as warriors from across Turkish Anatolia, sought to join the most successful Beylik, could operate in multiple directions simultaneously without exhausting resources. His administrative institutions had evolved to govern diverse urban populations effectively, solving challenges that defeated many conquerors and creating stable governance that made Ottoman rule preferable to Byzantine decline. Most significantly, Ottoman expansion had gained psychological momentum that proved self-reinforcing. Each victory attracted more warriors seeking glory and plunder, demoralized remaining Byzantine resistance, and enhanced Ottoman reputation as a divinely favored power whose expansion represented historical inevitability rather than temporary success. The personal triumph of Sultan Orhan, watching his forces consolidate control over territories that Byzantine emperors had ruled for over a millennium, validated the strategic vision and patient state-building he had pursued since inheriting his father's modest principality 23 years earlier. He had proven that Turkish warriors could defeat Byzantine imperial armies in pitched battle, not just conduct hit-and-run raids. He had demonstrated that Ottoman forces could capture and govern major fortified cities through sophisticated siege warfare and effective post-conquest administration. He had established precedents and patterns of generous surrender, religious tolerance, and competent governance that would guide Ottoman expansion for centuries. Most importantly, he had transformed the Ottoman Principality from one ambitious Beylik among many into the clearly dominant power in northwestern Anatolia, whose future expansion seemed limited only by the resources and determination his successors would bring to the enterprise. The victory at Pelekanon, though just one battle in decades of Ottoman expansion, represented the moment when Byzantine hopes of restoring Anatolia died, and when Ottoman destiny as a world historical empire became clear to all who could read the signs. The Battle of Pelekanon's place in the broader sweep of history extends far beyond its immediate tactical and strategic consequences, representing one of those pivotal moments when the trajectory of civilization shifts definitively and the balance of power undergoes fundamental reordering that shapes subsequent centuries. The Byzantine defeat in 1329 marked not just the loss of one battle, but the end of realistic Byzantine hopes of maintaining their Anatolian presence, the validation of Ottoman military and administrative capabilities against the empire that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for over a millennium, and the psychological turning point where populations throughout the region recognized that the future belonged to the rising Ottoman power rather than the declining Byzantine Empire. Modern historians, examining the battle with benefit of hindsight about subsequent events, consistently identify Pelekanon as the moment when Byzantine Anatolia's fate was sealed, and when the Ottoman trajectory toward imperial greatness became irreversible, even though contemporaries could not have fully grasped the long-term implications of what appeared at the time to be simply another battle in the endless conflicts between Christians and Muslims in 14th century Anatolia. The military lessons from Pelekanon resonated through subsequent Ottoman warfare for centuries, establishing tactical and strategic principles that would be refined but not fundamentally altered by future generations of Ottoman commanders. The battle demonstrated that mobility and harassment could defeat heavily armored cavalry if terrain was chosen carefully, and if commanders possessed the discipline to avoid being drawn into the kind of confrontation where heavy cavalry advantages would be decisive. It validated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, employing mounted archers for harassment and disruption alongside elite cavalry for decisive strikes at opportune moments. It proved that superior logistics and intelligence could create battlefield conditions where tactical superiority mattered less than strategic positioning and preparation. Most importantly, it showed that defeating enemy field armies served Ottoman expansion more effectively than prolonged sieges alone, as battlefield victories shattered enemy morale and credibility in ways that patient territorial acquisition could not match. These lessons would inform Ottoman campaigns from the Balkans to Anatolia to eventually the gates of Vienna, creating a military tradition that made Ottoman forces among the most formidable of the early modern period. The psychological and cultural impact of Pelekanon on both Byzantine and Ottoman societies revealed how military outcomes shape collective identities and historical narratives in ways that transcend immediate political consequences. For Byzantines, the defeat became emblematic of their empire's tragic decline, a moment when the inheritors of Rome's glory were humiliated by forces they had long considered barbarian inferiors, feeding into broader narratives about Byzantine decadence and divine punishment that Byzantine intellectuals and religious authorities would debate for the remaining century of the empire's existence. Byzantine chronicles written after Pelekanon struggled to explain how God could permit such defeats if Byzantium truly retained its status as a divinely favored Christian empire, generating theological and philosophical debates that reveal deep anxiety about imperial identity and purpose. For the Ottomans, Pelekanon became a foundational myth, validating their expansion as divinely ordained and demonstrating that Turkish Muslim warriors possess superiority over Christian forces regardless of the latter's historical prestige or numerical advantages. Ottoman chronicles and popular histories celebrated Orhan's victory as proof that Ottoman destiny involved far greater achievements than merely controlling northwestern Anatolia, creating cultural narratives that would sustain imperial ambitions through subsequent centuries of expansion. The economic and demographic transformations accelerated by Pelekanon's outcome reshaped Anatolia's character in ways that remain visible in modern Turkey's linguistic, religious, and cultural geography. The Greek Christian emigration from northwestern Anatolia that intensified after Byzantine military defeat proved largely irreversible, as few refugees ever returned to their ancestral homes, and those who remained gradually converted to Islam or were absorbed into Turkish Muslim majority populations. The Turkish migration into the region, encouraged by Ottoman settlement policies that offered land and opportunities to colonists, transformed the demographic balance from a Greek Christian majority to Turkish Muslim dominance within several generations. The economic systems that emerged under Ottoman governance, while incorporating some Byzantine precedents, fundamentally altered land tenure, taxation, and commercial organization in ways that destroyed Byzantine aristocratic structures and created new social hierarchies based on Ottoman administrative and military service. This transformation, though it would take generations to complete, began in earnest after Pelekanon destroyed Byzantine capacity to contest Ottoman dominance and open northwestern Anatolia to unrestricted Turkish settlement and Islamic institutional development. The diplomatic and international implications of Ottoman victory at Pelekanon reverberated throughout the eastern Mediterranean world and eventually into European politics, as powers throughout the region recognized that a new and formidable player had emerged in regional geopolitics. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria, previously the dominant Muslim power in the eastern Mediterranean, began monitoring Ottoman expansion with a mixture of approval for Muslim advances against Christians and concern that Ottoman power might eventually challenge Mamluk regional supremacy. Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, recalibrated their diplomatic and commercial strategies to accommodate the reality that the Ottomans now controlled crucial territories and trade routes, leading to complex negotiations that would eventually produce commercial treaties granting Italian merchants access to Ottoman markets in exchange for various concessions. European kingdoms, though still largely focused on their own regional conflicts, began receiving reports from their ambassadors and merchants about this dynamic Turkish power that had defeated the Byzantine Empire in open battle, planting seeds for the European anxieties about Ottoman expansion that would intensify over subsequent centuries as Ottoman armies pushed into the Balkans and eventually threatened Central Europe. The institutional and administrative developments that Pelekanon's aftermath enabled proved perhaps more historically consequential than the battle itself, as Ottoman victory created security and resources allowing Orhan to refine governing structures that would sustain the empire for 6 centuries. The period following Pelekanon witnessed the systematic organization of the Timar system that would provide Ottoman military and administrative backbone for generations. Comprehensive surveys documenting property and tax obligations throughout conquered territories. The establishment of judicial systems combining Islamic Sharia law with customary regulations adapted to local conditions, and the creation of educational institutions training future administrators and religious officials. These developments, though lacking the drama of battlefield victories, established the Ottoman capacity for effective governance of vast multi-ethnic, multi-religious territories that would distinguish the Ottoman Empire from other successful conqueror states that expanded rapidly but collapsed quickly due to inadequate administrative institutions. The sophisticated state apparatus that emerged in northwestern Anatolia during the years after Pelekanon provided a template that would be replicated throughout the empire's subsequent expansion, enabling Ottomans to govern territories from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq, with remarkable stability for centuries. The final historical judgment on the Battle of Pelekanon must acknowledge both its immediate significance as Byzantine Anatolia's death knell and its broader role in facilitating the rise of an empire that would reshape Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and eventually European history for 6 centuries. Emperor Andronikos III's decision to personally lead the relief expedition to Nicaea, though militarily rational given the stakes involved, ultimately exposed Byzantine military weakness in ways that shattered imperial credibility throughout Anatolia and accelerated territorial losses that might otherwise have occurred more gradually. Sultan Orhan's tactical and strategic decisions before and during the battle demonstrated the military sophistication and political acumen that had transformed a modest frontier principality into the dominant power in northwestern Anatolia and would eventually create one of history's great empires. The battle's outcome, decisive Ottoman victory that destroyed the Byzantine field army and ended realistic imperial hopes of restoring Anatolian control, marking the point where the long Byzantine decline became an irreversible collapse in Asia, while the Ottoman rise gained unstoppable momentum. In this sense, Pelekanon represents one of those rare historical moments where a single battle's outcome genuinely altered civilization's trajectories, ended one empire's dominance while launching another's ascent, and shaped the future in ways that remain visible in modern geopolitics, demographics, and cultural geography. The Ottoman Empire that would eventually conquer Constantinople, dominate the Mediterranean, and threaten Vienna traced its origins not just to Osman's initial frontier struggles, but to Orhan's victory on the hills near Pelekanon in 1329, where Byzantine dreams of Anatolian restoration died and Ottoman imperial destiny was born.